Donna Zakowska, Emmy-winning costume designer of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Season 4 takes place in the 60s. So what has it been like to be part of a period show like Maisel from the start and be able to move through time with it into a new decade now?
Well, I think, we haven't moved that quickly. We've
Mhm.
moved from 1957 to 61-ish, although the new season, which I can't talk about, will really push it a bit. I think what's great about it is that, really developing these characters, um, and just sort of portraying the various phases, in their life and doing it through the costumes. It's sort of a very lucky thing to be able to do that. You don't usually have that. And so it's been very sort of enjoyable doing that and has really been subtle the way we've developed and really very controlled, which is also sort of great. That it's been little steps versus just big, big steps.
Right. And I would say like that's the case like in real life too, in
Mm.
fashion like transitioning from the 50s to 60s. So I guess what would you say is are like the key differences between 50s fashion and 60s fashion and how did you work that into season 4?
Well, I think the silhouette changes. I think the biggest change is really 63, which we don't quite hit, which is where you have sort of Pierre Cardin, and I always talk about the space age type of look. But I think the silhouette really changes. I mean, I think the 50s is very much about curving and round. It's the, opposite of the 40s. And then you get into these early 60s and everything becomes a little bit more square, a little bit shorter. It's sort of like things tend to shrink a bit, but then pattern becomes like a much more of an element, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I noticed now that I think about it, like this season, the skirts are a lot more tapered,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Oh,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah. I mean, well, when you begin with the 40s and that sort of A line, and then the 50s really blows out, and then the 60s, begins to become closer to the body, and it's a very different type of tailoring. I think the 50s tailoring, it's so influenced by Dior and Balenciaga and all of these great designers of the 50s. And I think that there is the beginning of a sort of casualness in the 60s that then, as you start getting into the late 60s, really sort of blossoms.
Yeah, for sure. I think everyone knows the late 60s fashion style. Yeah.
Mod, we're not really, we never really did that, although there's small things like, the way I've changed the hats, like using the bucket hats and the different shapes of the hats. Like those are the elements that I've used to sort of create a very subtle sort of transition. I mean, I think what we've really been dealing with is a transitional period. And I think that's always like very interesting when you see like the remnants of what has come before and where you're moving. And a lot of times people don't deal with the transition. You're either in the 50s or the 60s. So I've really embraced being in a transition
Mhm.
and sort of bringing things in a subtle way, but yet changing the silhouette, feeling the movement forward, but not like abruptly, really, not doing anything too abrupt.
Right, for sure. And it's still like in it for the characters, like for Midge, it's a transitional period for her career as well. Like,
Mm-hmm.
she should be taking these steps that maybe she's not taking yet. But like pink has always been her color.
Right.
So how did you go about evolving that through this season and through her clothing? And she also wears like some green, which I know you've said is like her heroic color as well.
Right, right, exactly. Well, I think you never abandon the character. The character is something that you have from the beginning, and as you go through a series, that character develops, and you sort of cling to certain things that, as I always talk about, are echoes. Like the certain colors are echoes of the character, echoes of their sort of mental landscapes, and so pink definitely still appears, and but in a much more subtle way. And when it appears, that I'm sort of referring back to something that is a more traditional image of Midge of herself. I mean, throughout the series, I've really played a lot with color, and the color has been sort of inspired by, first of all, the research in 50s fashion, which is like there's spectacular use of color when you look at magazines, from about 55 to 60, and so I have sort of tried to continue which was something which I found like incredibly dynamic when I sort of discovered it. And, it's really become the vocabulary and things like pink, green, or whatever. It's the vocabulary for me of this entire series, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, your episode submission was the sixth episode, and so Midge, her usual like stage look is black, but you've been kind of like updating that look a little bit. Like it's still mostly black, but like in that episode, she's in one scene she has like a sort of like a crop jacket top, and then at the end, like during like seconds count, it's like a black dress with this like double pink and orange bow belt. So can you talk about like updating her stage look?
Well, I sort of found lots of ways. I mean, in a way, you want to start introducing color,
Mm-hmm.
but black still becomes a little characteristic color of her performance.
Right.
So I dealt a lot with a lot of different accessories, like in terms of maybe the trims or the two pink, sort of sashes, which had a very Obi-like, concept for me. The pinks together. So that's what we're talking about. You're seeing the pink, you're
Right.
seeing what that means for the character, but then finding this sort of new way of introducing it, and also, just sort of expanding her performance look. I mean, I don't know how many black dresses I've designed, maybe 50 or I don't know, something like that. So you sort of have to find a way to sort of go beyond what you've done before. And the accessories became like a big part of it for me.
Right. Yeah. And it shows like she's also kind of like experimenting and it's like slightly changing. It's not too
Right.
classic. Yeah.
Mm,
Well, that episode, Jane Lynch, you also wears this incredibly gorgeous black and white checkered coat. Uh,
mm, yeah.
how did that come about?
Well, again, everything that I do really comes from research, and then the expansion of the research, into the palette that I want to introduce, and then, how I want to sort of transform the shapes. I mean, I did find a piece of research that, was somewhat reminiscent of that, but then I felt with Jane is so able to carry like bold patterns, bold shapes. There's always been something a little bit sort of practically, Asian to a degree and exotic in other ways about her clothing, like using things that are obi-like or using things that have a kimono-esque quality to it. And she is a theatrical personality, and she's theatrical in Mrs. Maisel. So that was sort of the theatrical. Everything I've done for her has always had that edge to it. She really is the diva off stage, the performer off stage, and as a person, she can really handle very bold patterns, very bold shapes, and so I really embraced it when I was designing Jane's, and the use of the turban
Mhm.
and all of those things just made her a little bit bigger than life in a way.
Yeah, for sure. Because especially like opposite Midge, like it feels like she's towering over her.
Mhm.
And the coat is obviously like bigger than like the dress or like the coat that Midge is wearing as well,
Well,
too.
she is physically,
Yes.
but I think it's also more of a sort of theatrical energy,
Mhm.
that is a part of that
Right.
character. And Midge, Midge is a much more, she is theatrical, but it's a much more contained energy in a way.
Mhm.
I mean, they're very different physical types completely, actually.
Lastly, what can you say about season five, the fifth and final season?
Well, basically nothing, but I think that, of course, it is our last season. We're a little sad about it. But I think, we're finding, different ways of tying up the characters. And I think that season five actually has a few very theatrical, exciting elements in it, which again, I can't reveal. But we did a few things that we've never really done before, like staging some theatrical, productions in the middle of it. But I think what, season five is a little bit about looking back, the characters sort of being who they are, but then in small ways, trying to get the momentum forward. So there is, the only thing I will say, there is a little bit of a back and forth in terms of time, and much more than you've like ever seen before, actually.
Interesting. Well, can't wait to see it. Donna, it was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your
Okay,
time, and we'll see you back in a little bit.
okay, great.
Thank you.